Goldstein.
Okay, I'm very happy to have on the Goldstein on Gelt Show, Tim Sandefur, who is a principal attorney at the Pacific Legal Foundation. He works to protect businesses against abusive government regulation. He's actually written a number of books. One of them I read and really enjoyed was called The Cornerstone of Liberty, Property Rights in the 21st Century America. Tim, real pleasure to have you.
Thanks so much. I do have to correct you on one little thing. I'm actually now the Vice President of Litigation for the Goldwater Institute in Arizona, and today is actually my first day on the job. So.
Okay, well, good luck. I'm glad that we got you there. So let's talk about your book a little bit. In the book, you gave some fascinating examples about how the government has abused its power of eminent domain, which is the power the government has literally to take people's property. And in reading your book, I was really frightened, and I felt the courts were supporting the government, and I felt like the little guy has no chance. On the other hand, it does seem as though there is a time when the government does have to step in. You know, if we take an extreme example like, an unused barn that's stopping the construction of a major highway. How can society deal with those gray areas?
Well, I think the way society has come up with to deal with those gray areas is precisely the constitutional method of giving just compensation to people when it takes their property, and taking their property only when necessary for a public use, as opposed to a private use. So the typical example is if you're building a highway or something, a person who owns a house in the path of the projected highway might say, well, okay, he can have my land, but only for $1 billion, because they know that if they hold out for a really high price, that they can force the people to compensate them unreasonably. And the purpose of eminent domain is to prevent that holdout problem by allowing the government to say, no, we're going to take your property because it's necessary. But in exchange for that, we're not going to exploit our monopoly advantage as the government, since there are no competing buyers when the government's taking your property. We're going to prevent the abuse of that power by first ensuring that the taking is actually for the use of the public, and secondly, by ensuring that a court oversees an adequate compensation amount.
Okay, well, from your own book, neither of those systems seems to work very well. The first one, in reverse order, is that the courts seem to side with the government and just take whatever you want. And secondly, is this concept of public use, as in fact, one of the examples you gave is that the government just said, well, we're going to take the property from 2,500 Michigan residents and give it to General Motors because then we'll collect more tax revenues, which of course is good for the public. So I don't see how you solve this problem. It's easy to talk about, but at the end of the day, how does the Constitution really deal with this?
Well, that decision in that Michigan case in the 1980s was plainly contrary to the Constitution. What happened was that, of course, in 1981 there was a very severe recession, hit the auto industry particularly hard in Michigan. And so General Motors went to the city of Detroit and said, well, if you condemn this large section of this neighborhood called Pole Town because of the large number of Polish immigrants who live there, and give it to us, we'll build a GM car factory there and make Cadillacs and make a whole bunch of money, and the government will enjoy more tax revenue out of that. Well, that's not what the Constitution means when it uses the phrase public use. It means use by the public. It doesn't mean whatever benefits the government in some abstract or indirect way, because, of course, everything can be said to benefit the government in some abstract or indirect way. If tax revenue to the government is a public use, then the government should take my house and replace it with a Ritz-Carlton hotel, because that would increase tax revenue to the government. So that's not what public use means, and the Michigan Supreme Court got it wrong when it said that GM could indeed take this property. And the Michigan Supreme Court has acknowledged as much. About 20 years later, the court came back and said, we got it wrong in that Pole Town case. Public use doesn't mean public benefit. Those two things don't mean the same thing. So the way that the Constitution can protect people is by being obeyed. Unfortunately, the Constitution is only words written on paper. It's a promise, and it's only as good as the people who either abide by that promise or break that promise.
All right, this is getting a little depressing. We're talking with Tim Sandefur, who is a lawyer who helps businesses to protect themselves against abusive government regulation. Tim, I want to touch on something you said a minute ago, which was you brought up this concept of taxes. first we spoke about eminent domain as something that says the government is allowed to take property if it's for public use. Do taxes basically fit into that? Is tax a legitimate form of property confiscation?
That's actually a very deep and interesting question, because taxes are considered, philosophically speaking, if you go back to the roots of the American Constitution, taxes are considered very different than eminent domain. Eminent domain is part of the government's power to require public service of people. And so it's basically like the military draft. And in fact, some state constitutions in the United States still use the same terminology. I know, for instance, the state of Tennessee, its constitution says that the government cannot require a person's property or personal services without just compensation. And the reason why is because the power to seize property through eminent domain and the power to draft people into the military, those were considered as part of this deep power of sovereignty that government has. And that's different than the power of taxation, which is a power to require everybody to pay to the government for the costs of security and safety. When you pay taxes to the government, you're getting a service in exchange for that, which is the service of a lawful society. When you have your property taken through eminent domain, though, that you are suffering a unique injury that your neighbors aren't suffering because they aren't losing their property. And so the government has to ensure that it justly compensates you for that taking. So those are actually considered two different aspects of government power. Now, more recently, all of these philosophical understandings have broken down, largely as a result of progressive era thinkers like Oliver Wendell Holmes and other justices on the Supreme Court in the 1900s, who said, no, these distinctions don't make any difference. It's just whether the government can take your stuff. That's all that matters. And so they said, for example, when it comes to regulations, the government can regulate your property as much as it wants to. It's just that at some point or other, it kind of crosses the line, and then the government has to compensate you because it's taken away the value of your property. And these fuzzy, blurry distinctions, this lack of intellectual rigor, that's just why we have this problem with eminent domain today, because lawyers and judges aren't thinking in these clear philosophical categories anymore.
And of course, I think very often the people who get hit with this don't have the financial backing simply to protect themselves because it's some poor guy who's put all his savings into a house. Tim, now one of the things that I always like to do on the Goldstein on Gelt show, because this is really fundamentally an investment show, I want to ask you an investment question. And I know that you're not an investment advisor, but based on, frankly, a lot of your writing and a lot of the topics you're bringing up today, I find it frightening for people who consider investing in things like cheap houses, or they go into neighborhoods where they can, literally pick up a house that's in default, because they think that the risk they have might be, well, it's a bad investment, or it'll go down in value, or if you get tenants, they won't pay. But I'm getting the feeling that there's really a government risk that one day the government could just come in and say, we've decided to give the rights to this land to a real estate developer to build a mall, and so we're taking it away from you. Should people worry about that when they do investing, or is it just, it's 1 in a million, so so don't worry about it?
No, they certainly should worry about it, although I understand that some insurance policies will cover you in the event of eminent domain, but there's an even broader problem, which is for example, when a city's going to take away somebody's property through eminent domain, very often it does it not for roads or highways, but for these government redevelopment projects. We mentioned the Michigan General Motors case in the 1980s, for example. And these redevelopment projects, the way they work in a lot of places is the local government will declare a neighborhood to be blighted. And the term blight, again, it's one of these fuzzy, hard to define terms. It basically means whatever the government says it means. Blight means that the neighborhood isn't performing up to an economic standard that the government would prefer. So, for example, California law says that a neighborhood is blighted if it has, among other things, insufficient parking. Well, what neighborhood doesn't, right?
Like my office, right?
Yeah, and once the government declares a neighborhood to be blighted, it can then come along and use eminent domain as part of a redevelopment project to take away all the land in that neighborhood and give it to a developer to build a shopping mall or what have you. Even if your property is not blighted, if your neighbor's property is, then the entire neighborhood can be declared blighted and your property can be taken away. Now, it gets even worse because when the government declares a neighborhood to be blighted, that designation can sit on the books basically indefinitely. Some states require that they be renewed every few decades, but nevertheless, they remain on the books indefinitely. So it's very possible for an investor to come along and not familiar with this system and see, wow, look at this. Here's a really affordable, nice piece of land. I'm going to buy that and fix it up and everything. But if it's been declared blighted, you have the specter of eminent domain hanging over your head that entire time. And wise investors know this, and so they don't invest in those neighborhoods, which does what? It causes further blight because, of course, you're not going to have economic development in an area that has a blight designation, which is basically a sword of Damocles hanging over your head that could fall on you at any time. So there are some states where this problem has become so severe. For instance, Missouri. In Missouri, the Missouri Supreme Court recently declared that if the government declares a neighborhood blighted and then just leaves that designation in place for too long, that itself can qualify as the taking away of your private property. That's a very good decision. It's terrible that these bureaucrats can declare neighborhoods blighted and thereby threaten them with eminent domain and then sit back and do nothing, destroying the possibility that that investors could come in and fix up the neighborhood. Right. But a lot of the time the reason they do that is because with that blight designation sitting there, the property values fall down, and then the government can come in and acquire the land for cheaper. It's a really nasty trick, but a lot of governments do that.
Wow. It's amazing. The amount of information and the number of stories talking to you reminds me of reading your book, Cornerstone of Liberty, Property Rights in 21st Century America. Tim, there's a lot more, and I know you're working on a lot of other new ideas. So in the last few seconds, just tell us, how can people follow you and follow your work?
Well, the Goldwater Institute can be found at goldwaterinstitute.org. We're based in Phoenix, but we work across the nation to protect property rights, economic liberty, and other important constitutional values. And, of course, my book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and through the Cato Institute, which published it.
Okay, we will put links to all of that at the show notes of today's show at goldsteinongelt.com. Tim Sandefur, thanks so much for your time.
You are listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.